one of the things that I did at the break is I went and I sat out there and I kind of reoriented myself, and I realized all the things I didn't say this morning that were in my outline, but because I got so caught up in listening to you. If I believe leadership begins with listening, I got caught up in talking to you, and I forgot to throw in. Can I resolve that by telling a couple of more things that I think we probably should have covered this morning? Because I felt like I left you hanging at one point. We talked about leadership begins with listening, and I talked to you about who to listen to and what to listen for and how to listen well, and then I didn't tell you what to do. You're like, okay, great, now you told me all about listening, but I didn't actually give you any next steps. And I think I told you my job is to give you the next faithful step, and I blew it. I forgot that to close the loop on that. You mind if I take the time to close the loop on that? So, what's somebody going to do? Say, no. Please don't do that. Move on. So, let's say for a moment that, can I just use you as a group? Let's just say we're a team. And I happen to be the head of the team. It could be a youth ministry. It could be a church. It could be whatever. And let's say we have a staff meeting. Do you ever go to meetings? Is that part of your life? Do you ever go to meetings?
All the time.
If you want to change the culture of your congregation, you've heard a lot about culture. Let me tell you how to change the culture of your congregation. It works this way. Metrics create incentives. I'm going to say the whole thing and then I'll summarize it again. Metrics create incentives. Incentives create habits, and habits change culture. Metrics create incentives. Incentives create habits, and habits change culture. So you got to figure out the right thing to measure. Metrics are just, the idea, what gets measured gets done. And I would argue that we in the church measure the wrong things. The first thing that happens when we have a conversation between pastors is implicitly each of you wants to tell the other approximately what your attendance is so that they you know where to slot each other. You're one of those, as opposed to, it's the kind of way you measure each other out. Attendance is not very interesting to me as a metric. But metrics create incentives, incentives create habits, and habits change culture. What's a good metric? And this is where I want to give you a next step on something to try.
Souls saved.
What's that?
Souls saved.
Okay, souls saved. That would be great. How do we measure that? Can I look at you and go, okay, when you came in this morning, your soul wasn't very saved. But by the end of the day, your soul was really very saved. I'm not sure how to measure that one. Yeah, sir.
Attendance in Bible study.
Okay, attendance, baptism. We're getting someplace. What I want to suggest instead is I want to take a measure from athletics. Y'all know about sports here in the South? Does some of you like some sports? If you were, say, pick a name. I don't know, Nick Saban. You may have heard of him. If you were to talk to him and ask him what he measures, he doesn't measure outcomes. He measures process. If you want to know what he's looking for, he wants to know how many hours you spent in the weight room. He wants to know all the pieces of what it means to be a good athlete. He doesn't actually measure things like whether or not you tackled somebody. Because if you get all the pieces, it will add up to something we care about. Because if we pay attention to the end result, nobody has a good plan for how to get there. So baptisms is something we can agree on, but how do you get there? So remember I said leadership begins with listening? Here is the very first place I start. If you remember I told you I worked with like 100 congregations? The congregations that eventually did well did what I'm about to tell you. The congregations that didn't do well tended not to do what I'm about to tell you. Now, I can't make a promise, but I can say it tends to go this way or it tends to go that way. And let's say we're a team. And here are only 3 questions that you could regularly ask. Our team gets together and you ask, who did you listen to this week? What did you hear? And who are you going to listen to next week? If you just asked, who did you listen to this week? What did you hear? And who are you going to listen to next week? And if we just spend time talking about what we hear, remember I told you, we can't do the work of innovation until we have been transformed. What am I going to do? Turn to you and go say, please go home and be transformed. When you're transformed, let me know. That doesn't do you any good. You want a next step. You want something really tangible. And so the teams that I know that have done well have set a number. Usually it's about 3 people a week that I'm going to listen to. And I'm going to try and listen to them just tell their story. In a moment I can tell you how to ask that. But it seems like it's a pretty, people often want a big thing to do differently so that we get a big result. I will tell you, if you do this small thing well, it will change you. And if you try to skip this step, you won't get any further. Now, I can't promise that because, maybe God will do something. Remember we said God gives the increase. But I can point to the years of experience I've had working with congregations. And I can say the number one predictor of whether or not you will be able to do something new and interesting is the degree to which you're willing to say, who did you listen to this week? What did you hear? And who are you going to listen to next week? And you're like, well, that seems way too doable. Can we have something harder? Here is the number one complaint I get when I say that. Pastor will sidle up to me at the break and say, I'm too busy writing my sermons and leading my church to spend time listening to people. And I will say back to that person, you're too busy not to. Because if you want the results to be the same, keep doing the same thing. If you want your results to be different, you don't want a giant plan. You're too tired. Remember we said we're too tired? You're too tired. What is something you can do that if you do that well for 3 months, will it make a difference? Yeah, it will. So that's one very specific thing. And one of the things I've found is that in groups like this, if you can find another congregation that you think is like you, whoever it is, they may not be in your area, but just somebody that's like, what our commitments are, the Roman Catholic group's going, great, we're all by ourselves. But, find some other church that's like you and figure out, how can we hold each other accountable? And what do you hold each other accountable for? Big changes? Nope. Michael, you said you've got coaches, right? If I were coaching, and when we do this stuff, we do coaching, the number one question that coaches ask every time is, are you listening? And specifically, are you asking, who did you listen to? What did you hear? And how will you listen? Who are you going to listen next week? It freaks people out when you start listening to them. Because you keep learning and hearing things you did not expect to hear. So that's number one. Number two is, when you listen for 2 things. One is for, what is just the experience of people? I'll give you an example. One of the groups of churches that I've worked with is in around San Antonio, Texas. And this last winter, they had a massive ice storm. You heard about that? Places where nothing froze, usually it was, the world ended for a couple of days for them. And just after that, I was doing work with one of the pastors. And he said, I'm having trouble with this whole listening to people's longings and losses because every time I get together, all they want to do is talk about the ice storm. And I said, well, I think that's kind of their longing and loss right now. And he looked at me with that, dang, I think you might be right. And so what we agreed on is for the next month, every single time he sat with anyone, whether it was standing in line at a grocery store or any time he struck up a conversation with anybody, he would just simply say, what was your experience of the ice storm? And he said, I never had so many evangelistic conversations with people who were not Christians as I had in that month. Because I just simply started by saying, what was your experience of something we all experienced, and everybody's got a story. And that in that story, they end up talking about their family, they end up talking about all these things that are important to them, and it gave him just an easy segue to tell me, oh, tell me about your son who has the broken arm and is really sad. Or in one case, he has a story about where one of the families he talked about, they had a son who was a college or high school athlete who had blown out his Achilles. ACL. And, what was that like for you to have a kid that had been working for 10 years on something, and then right in his junior year of high school, he loses that? And they started talking about it, and they started talking about the longings and losses of what it means to be a parent and what it means to be a kid, and all these, you can imagine how these can go to all sorts of places just by simply asking. Now I'm guessing, how was your experience of the ice storm? Ain't gonna work in Birmingham. But you could ask, for example, I don't know, what's been your experience of the pandemic? I heard it made it all the way here. I mean, everybody's got their own experience. Or in your particular case, if I understand it correctly, the last 6 or 8 weeks, the whole Delta thing's been completely different. So what's been your experience the last few weeks of, everybody's got a story to tell. Listen to their story, but listen to who's the people in the story. Who's the family they talk about? What's their job that they talk? They're going to give you all sorts of insights into their life, where if you just walked up and said, tell me about your family and your job, they're not going to do that. But what's been your experience of the pandemic? They're going to share all sorts of stuff with you. Now, the problem with asking about the pandemic, can I just say it out loud, is that it has been politicized. And that some people are going to give you things you don't want to hear. And you'll notice I'm not saying that the conservatives will give you things that the liberals don't want. Both sides are just going to give you stuff you don't want to hear, whatever you stand on all of this. But even that tells you what's important to people. I happen to come from a family filled with people who have medical backgrounds. And so for me, I have always seen the pandemic as a medical crisis. Not as a political crisis, not as a thing about individual rights or anything. But that's not has anything to do with my political stance. It's because, I said my sister-in-law is a nurse practitioner. My mother is a nurse. My daughter's in med school. We were just conditioned to talk to, when my mom went to nursing school when I was in high school. And so the normal topic of conversation in our household involved dinner table conversation happened and talk about bodily fluids, for example. Just because that was how she spent her day. And we thought that was really normal. And I'm the oldest kid in the family, and I brought my girlfriend home one night for dinner. And she was like, what the heck was that? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Because we just had medical conversation because that was what was going on. So I'm conditioned to see the world in a particular way. I have to recognize everybody else in the world sees it very differently. I have to find a way to listen to them on their terms, whatever those terms are. But if you want one concrete thing you can do that will make the biggest difference in your church is just decide that every time your either staff or your church board gets together, you say you're going to ask 3 questions. Who did you listen to this week? What did you hear? Who are you going to listen to next week? Now, what's going to happen is after you've done this a few times, they're going to say to you, we need some better lessons and how to learn or how to listen well. Well, okay, since you asked for it, we'll be glad to do that kind of training for you. But if you'd gone to them and said, I've been watching you and I think you need listening training, how's that going to go over for somebody? But if you send them out to listen and they say, we need more training, they're asking you for the thing you want to provide. And then you can do the piece on the empathy training that's in chapter 3. And I think that you can do some really interesting stuff, but it opens those doors. So anyway, I should have closed the loop this morning and say, if you want a next step, that's the next step that is the biggest predictor that will make a difference. I want to pause and say, it is not surprising if somebody's got questions or comments. Was that a hand up there?
It was. I was going to wait until you said whatever you said.
Nope, go.
You said that when you listen to 2 things, and the first one was the experiences of people. What's the second thing?
Well, the experience is, who are the people that matter most to them? Whether it's listen to for their family, their job, they're going to tell the story of the pandemic through the eyes of the people that matter most to them. And so that if you want to know somebody, you ask them about the people that matter most to them. Other thoughts, questions, comments, anything? Yes, sir.
Just to be clear, though, we are also listening for opportunities to turn that into a gospel conversation. Correct? Not always, but as the Spirit leads.
Well, here's the thing that I want to say is empathy cannot want control. And if the reason I am listening is so that I can turn it into what I want, I actually want eventually to be able to tell them about the gospel. I think it is much more likely that what I should do is listen a little longer than I think I should before I start trying to talk to them. I need to probably understand them better before I jump in. Let me go back to this example I used this morning. There's a woman named Gina who has this guy named Tran. And she listens to him, and at the right time, she does tell him the story of the gospel. But it took more listening. Well, there's an author I love who's written a wonderful book. Anybody who's a boss should read this book. I apologize. It does have swear words in it, and if that's going to offend you, don't read it. But it's written by a secular author, but has a deeply theological thing. And the book is called Radical Candor. And it's about how to be a boss. And I can summarize the entire book for you in 4 words. The entire book says the best way to be a boss is to care personally and challenge directly. But you're not allowed to challenge directly until you've cared personally. You can only challenge to the extent that you have cared. And that's why I was hedging a little bit about turning it into an evangelistic conversation. You can only challenge them or even offer them the gift of the gospel to the extent that they have already felt cared for. And why do we listen to them? If we listen to people so that we can turn them into church members, we have stopped seeing them the way Jesus sees them. If we listen to them because they are children of God who deserve to be listened to on their own terms because they bear within them the image of God, and the reason that we are offering them the gospel is because the gospel is God's response to why it's hard to be human, then we're on the right page. So I don't know you well enough to know what you were asking, but I wanted to be clear. I didn't want us to get to the point where we start to turn to people into projects. I didn't think that's where you were going, but I wanted to be clear about it.
No, I agree with you completely. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that sometimes conversation with strangers turn that way because they can bring it up or you sense it very clearly. But I agree with you. Usually you need
Yeah. Sometimes somebody shows up in your office and says, do you mind if we talk about God? And I have to say, I guess God rolled a tumbleweed into my life. But if you want to know what's the biggest predictor of your ability to help your congregation grow and change, it is instilling a habit of listening. That's what would do it. Okay, yes? Oh, well, sure, he started by, but the point was he wasn't actually there to ask me about money. The point was he wanted to tell me about the school so that later on somebody with a better job than his, he was an entry-level person, could come along and ask me for the money. And when they called to ask for the money, I said, well, we already gave money. And they said, oh, okay, bye, and hung up. And then 30 seconds later they called because the next person on the list was my wife, who is also a graduate of the school, and that same exact person had that conversation without ever realizing that he had talked to me 30 seconds ago.
And the reason that I asked, one, because I wanted to know, but two, because sometimes we make an assumption about why people come to you. You knew,
Yeah,
but what if you had made the assumption, shut him out the door, you would have never had the conversation about God.
well, part of what I think about is, do you know what it's like to say I'm the best version of myself and the worst version of myself? Normally it's about how much sleep I've had. But there is a version of me that is constantly open to others and willing to talk to them. And there's a version of me that would like everyone else to just be quiet so I can do whatever I'm doing. And I need to choose to be the best version of me, even when I find it inconvenient. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us the author's name for Growing Young? Because I found
Sure.
several.
Kara Powell.
Yeah.
It's a big green book.
Yep.
I can't believe I don't have a copy. I'm all, Kara Powell, Powell. Radical Candor. The author's name is Kim Scott. If you're really interested in working with young people, I'm going to offer you a second book. Because Kara has just come out with a brand new book, came out last week, that's a sequel, called 3 Questions That Every Teenager Asks. I'm getting the title wrong, but if you just Google 3 Questions and Teenager.
Three big questions that change every teenager.
There you go, 3 big questions that change every teenager. The project that I did with my book and the project that Growing Young and that book come out of, they're companion projects. There were 5 of us sitting around a table that were running all of those things. And if you wanted to see what it's like to go through the 5 steps that I talk about, making spiritual sense and all those things, read the 3 Big Questions book, because at no point does it mention me, but at every point it's working through the cycle that we created together. She starts about who are the people entrusted to your care? Well, it's teenagers in that story. What are their longings and losses? Well, she doesn't talk about longings and losses. She says, what are the 3 big questions they ask? And the 3 big questions that she would argue every teenager asks, I think every adult and human being asks, are about identity, belonging, and purpose. And that at all times we're always asking questions of identity, belonging, and purpose. And then you'll notice in my stuff I say, what's the big lie that people believe that prevent them from hearing the gospel? In her case, she talks about what is it that teenagers believe about God and their experience in the world that is misshapen, that is inappropriate. And then I ask, how do you make spiritual sense and how do you present that as a shared story of future hope? What she does is say, what is Jesus' better story? So she combines those last into. And so if you want to see an example of how that works, so I'd read those together. So if I understand it right, it's 2:15. We have until 3:30, is that right? We were going to have till 3, but we're going to just keep going because I've been taking questions. So I got about an hour and 15 minutes. And I've got 2 directions that I can go. And so I'm going to give you a say in how we go. And then I'm going to tell you what I think I want to do, and then you tell me if it's the right idea. Because again, if leadership begins with listening, I don't get to just impose it on you. I think the way to go is, I think the hardest move we haven't talked about yet is how do you make spiritual sense of people's longings and losses? You know, how do you do that in a way that both honors the past and embodies the future? So I think that's the way to go. But there are some of you who are interested in, no, how does change happen in an organization? And I want to know about change. I think the reason I'm going to hedge on the change piece is you can just read chapter 8. And that would be my lecture that I would have given you. So I'm headed towards instead talking about how do we make spiritual sense and how do we do it in a way that honors the past and moves towards the future. But I want to check with you. Would anyone like to rise up in protest and say, no, I want more change, please? Okay, so it's okay. But I wanted to check with you before I go on there. So what I want to suggest to you is, it turns out when we ask how do we maintain the past and at the same time move to the future, we are asking a question that Christians have been asking since the beginning of Christians. This is not a new question. That it's been, So for example, when I say making spiritual sense, what do I mean? I mean figuring out how to use Christian categories to live your life. And what are the implications? I would argue that almost all of the New Testament is designed on a case-by-case basis of making spiritual sense. So the book of Mark, how does it start out? It starts out, this is the story of Jesus the Christ. Right? Am I getting that right? What he's doing is that, as a professor, I'm pleased to see he has a thesis statement. What he's doing is he's saying, you people don't really know how to make sense of this Jesus guy. I want to tell you that the way to make sense of him is to think of him as the Messiah. And I'm going to explain to you what it means to be a Messiah. Or book of Acts, Acts 6, the question becomes, we have immigrant widows and we have native widows. And it turns out the church is privileging the native widows over the immigrant widows. What do we do? Well, we're going to figure that out. The solution is deacons. We ask in 1 Corinthians, what do we do with meat sacrificed to idols? Okay, we got a thing for that. Over and over again, much of the New Testament is about asking questions like, what do we do practically with this stuff and how do we make sense of it? And that's what we do. That's what most sermons should be, in my mind. To do that, you often have to help people, what's the term I'm looking for? You have to help them adopt, that was the term, adopt a new mental model. But to do that, I have to explain to you, what do I mean by mental models? So mental models are your image of how things should be. Let me give you an example. Picture a car, any car. What's a car? Whatever it is you're picturing, it probably has wheels and it has a steering wheel and it's got a windshield, something like that. Now if I show you one of those concept cars that doesn't have a steering wheel or doesn't have wheels, I don't know what that thing is, but it ain't a car. Okay, that was easy. There's a question I ask my students often. What is your mental model of a preacher? Now, I've had students who've grown up in the same church for all of their years, and the only thing they've ever seen of a preacher is a man standing in a warehouse on a stage in a Hawaiian shirt with a black Bible in this hand, talking verse by verse through the scriptures. Now, that is a model of preaching, but in their mind, it's the only one they've ever seen, and so everything else looks as strange to them as a three-wheeled car, because they don't know anything else. We all have mental models. And I want to suggest to you that a significant part of what Jesus did that you value most is change people's mental models. So let's go back to that book of Mark. Specifically, I want to take you to Mark chapter 8. Scholars will tell us that the book of Mark is constructed this way. It comes up and up and up to a high point, and then at that point, everything changes and points to the cross. And what's that high point? That high point is a conversation at the end of chapter 8. And it's a conversation about mental models. Jesus gathers the disciples together and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" In other words, what mental model do they use to make sense of me? Because I know that they don't just look at me and go, "He's a guy just like every other guy." As a matter of fact, they've already figured out he's probably not a rabbi. Whatever a rabbi is, that ain't it. And so, the disciples say to him, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah. In other words, what they did is they went searching through their mental database and they came up with a word called prophet. And a prophet is somebody who says things that make us feel uncomfortable, that we revere long enough to feel uncomfortable, but eventually we ignore and kill him. Yeah, that's what a prophet is. And so that's kind of, they think Jesus is a prophet. But then Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And what does Peter say? You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Now, they had a category for it. They had a mental model to put him in. And then the scripture says, and then Jesus went on to explain to them that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and suffer and die, and after 3 days rise from the dead. And Scripture says, and Jesus explained it to them plainly. Here's my question for you: did they get it? Yeah, absolutely. They're just like, no. Whatever you just explained to us, that's. Now, think about it. What's going on here? Do you think Jesus had enough authority to be teaching them? Yep. You think Jesus was a pretty good teacher? He's a pretty good teacher. He's pretty good at it, right? Do you think Jesus had more authority than you will ever have with your congregation? And he tried to change their mental model of a Messiah. And how did that work out for him? They didn't get it. But remember I told you people don't resist change. They resist loss. So if the disciples resisted that, we got to figure out what's it going to cost them. And to do that, we have to introduce another person into the story. And we're going to go and talk to James and John. Remember James and John? We're going to go talk to their mommy. Because James and John's mommy makes an appearance in the Gospels at one point. And what does James and John's mommy want?
The best for her boy.
I want my sons to sit on your left hand and your right hand. You see, because what happened is that when they had a mental model, they had actually a picture in their head. They pictured that the Messiah was going to be a king like David. He was going to have a kingdom. And in that kingdom, there would be a capital city. And in that capital city, there would be a palace. And in that palace, there would be a throne room. And in that throne room, there would be thrones. And there would be a throne. And next to that throne, there would be little thrones. So now we're back to the question of people don't resist change, they resist loss. What was it going to cost them? It was going to cost them their little thrones. Because they weren't really having an argument about the mental model of what it meant to be a Messiah. They were having an argument about what it meant to be the disciple of a Messiah. Because if the Son of Man must come and suffer, what's going to happen to their disciples? Because Jesus says, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel shall gain it. That's the end of the conversation. The end of that little Mark 8 conversation is not about what it means to be a Messiah. It's about what it means to be the disciple of a Messiah. They were having a very clear argument about mental models. And when did they finally get it? They didn't finally get it until the Holy Spirit comes in the book of Acts. Because up until then, they kept waiting for a Davidic king. And at some point they said to themselves, oh, that whole suffer and die and rise again 3 days, it wasn't a metaphor. Now, at this point, I cut the disciples some slack, because Jesus used a lot of really interesting metaphors. He said, be born again. That turned out to be a metaphor. So how did they know? I'm on the disciples' side on this one. But what I want you to see is that the most powerful thing Jesus did is he changed people's mental model. And when he could change the way they saw the world, then their behavior would change. He didn't spend a bunch of time telling them for their behavior to change. He wanted to get them to change the way they saw the world. And when they saw the world, the behavior came as a byproduct. You get that? That's your job. What's that? You mind? Yeah, I'm messing with your mental model. You thought I was here to teach. And now all of a sudden I wandered into preaching. And, can I get back behind the podium now? What I'm really interested in is what can you do to help people change their mental model? Because that will change their behavior. And so what I want to do is I want to suggest to you that one of the most powerful things you can do is draw on the Christian practices. Turns out that there are a bunch of historic practices. If you went to your congregation and said, I'm in favor of prayer, would there anybody go, no, I'm sorry, we had a conversation together and we've decided we're not that kind of church, that nobody here talks to God? I mean, there are certain things that are called, what scholars call them, constitutive practices. They constitute the faith. That if you engage in this practice correctly, you are by definition being Christian. And that if you're going to be Christian, you're going to eventually encounter this practice. So now we're back to the question that started us today. How do you move into the future with, at the same time, honoring the past? I would argue that it's by reinventing Christian practices. So let's go visit. This morning I gave you the example of lament. It's a Christian practice. I'll give you another example of how a church invented it. We had a group that came to one of our Growing Young events. We talked about lament. And he went back to his church. He was at a church that had a very large youth group, maybe 100 kids. And he took a bunch of styrofoam blocks and he painted them brown and he built what he called a wailing wall. Built it, in the corner of the youth room. And the wailing wall in Jerusalem where they slip prayers in between the cracks? What he did is he said, he gave his young people little slips of paper, little golf pencils, and he says, you can write whatever you want to God, and only two things will happen. Number one, the only people that will read it will be the adults for this group, and the only thing they will do in response is to pray. No one's going to seek you out and scold you. Because remember, the message of the Psalms and Laments is God can handle your honesty. And so they were trying to embody this kind of honesty. So the first couple of weeks they did that. They got some, it was pretty innocuous stuff. But after nothing happened, nobody freaked out. The young people started saying some really honest stuff. Some stuff they started talking about it together and they realized, the young people were saying to them, I have no place in my life where it's safe to talk about the things that I lie abed at night thinking about. These are things that are the most important and valuable to me, and I can't tell anybody. I can't tell my parents, they'd freak out. I can't tell my friends, they wouldn't understand. I can't say it out loud to you because, well, I'm embarrassed. And that became a fixture for a few months in the group of just, you can say whatever you want. And then it changed the way that youth group did the way that it did its teaching. basically they planned out, okay, if there are issues that are regularly coming up here, we're going to talk about those issues, not by how the church says we should talk about them, but starting with the kinds of things that we hear. Now, they weren't reading any, oh, look, somebody here said, but they would tell a story, usually out of one of the adults' own lives from when they were a teen, and know that it's going to resonate in the room. That's an example of reinventing a practice. If you have your hymnals, on page 98, I list 9 different Christian practices and about how we might reinvent them. And if you just kind of flip through the book, you can see every so often there are pages that are kind of in gray. Each of those gray pages is about reinventing one practice. So each of those 9 practices has a gray section at some point about where to reinvent it. And if you can't find it, just simply look in the index. So can I give you a couple of examples of what I mean by reinventing practices? Would that be helpful to you? So let me give you the first one. The first one is prayer. I had to reinvent prayer when my wife got cancer. Back in 2007, my wife was diagnosed with stage 3C breast cancer. For those of you who know how that works, that's one lymph node away from being stage 4 cancer, metastatic cancer. And each of us looked up the odds on the internet and decided never to talk to the other one about it. We didn't find out till years later that each of us had done that and decided, I don't want to burden my wife with that conversation, and she didn't want to burden me with that. But it was iffy. And I wanted to pray to God about that because it mattered a lot to me. But I realized that my understanding of prayer was not good enough to capture that moment. Sometimes prayer feels like we can just obligate God. Like if we get just the right words, we can make God do something. No, that's actually magic. Like if you got the right incantation. That's not prayer. But sometimes we kind of feel like prayer's like, well, it's just self-talk. I'm just talking to me, and that's all. No, that's not prayer either. So what exactly is prayer? And I basically came down to this. I needed to be able to offer my wife up to God in exactly the way that Abraham offered Isaac up to God. I had to be able to say, honestly, remember, lament is God can handle you honestly. So here's what I would do. I had a commute to work at the time. And it was the only time I was alone when I could, I normally on my commute I'd listen to the radio or, I'd listen to something uplifting for one of the rides and I'd listen to sports talk on the other one, something like that. But before I was allowed to turn on the radio, I had to do this. I had to have my little prayer ritual. And I would say, God, I don't want to have to trust you. If I could, I would keep this for myself and I would not give it to you. It is too important to me. I don't want to say to you, thy will be done. I want Jeannie to live. And it would be dishonest to say thy will be done because if I could, I would keep this. But I can't. So with all fear and trembling, I choose to trust you. But I choose to trust you because I have no other choice. And so what I would do is I would literally do this gesture. And I say, so God, I offer Jeannie up to you. You love her more than I do. And all I can do is present her to you with fear and trembling and ask that she be healed. And that was my prayer. But it changed how I pray going forward. Because I realize that that's all we can do with most of the things in our lives, is we can offer them up to God with fear and trembling and admit, if I could, if it was important to me, I probably wouldn't trust you. I'd rather I want what I want. But the fact of the matter is that I choose you because I have no choice. That's a different version of prayer. And when I talk to congregations, especially my congregation, about this, they see themselves in that prayer. And they find that to be the kind of prayer that they can pray during something like a pandemic, when they feel like they have no control. And the number one thing they want is more control. So that's one example of how we might reinvent a practice and offer it to people. Let me give you another one. The other practice that we might reinvent is Sabbath. Now, you all know what Sabbath is. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And we tend to define Sabbath as a day of rest. That is not how I define Sabbath. I define Sabbath as a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. And let me explain to you why. When was Sabbath created? Sabbath was created by in the Ten Commandments, when the children of Israel had been freed, I'm going to use that term in quotes, from Goshen, and they had run away from Pharaoh. They had been rescued by God, and they were in the wilderness in Sinai. And God gives them 10 commandments, one of which is about the Sabbath. Do you think that a people who had been enslaved for hundreds of years, working 7 days a week, do you think they needed to learn to labor well? They had that whole labor thing down. They needed to rest. But when we look at, for example, in Genesis, when it talks about it, it says God worked and then God rested, and the whole point of it is the healthy rhythm of both labor and rest. I think in our world, learning to labor well is often as difficult as learning how to rest well. It's especially true when I talk to young adults, where anyone under 40 counts as a young adult nowadays. Knowing how to labor well is hard. And the example that I use is, you all know what healthy eating is, right? And you all know what junk food is, right? You know the difference between healthy eating and junk food. Now, if all I'd done is gathered up for my lunch, gathered up some of those sweets and maybe some chips and made a mountain of those, and that was the only thing I ate for lunch, I would have enough calories to live. Is that healthy eating? I would like to suggest that every one of us engage in junk food labor and junk food rest. And that what we want is healthy labor and healthy rest. And that what Sabbath calls us to is a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. And that we need to teach our people to labor well just as much as we need to teach them to rest well. Let me give you an example of what I mean by rest well. Junk food rest for me looks like sitting in front of the TV flipping channels. You know, it'll be late at night, late at night for my age is after 9 o'clock. We literally go to bed at 8:30 in my house. We get up at 5:30. I mean, we are old people. And it's just, that's what we do. But if I stay up past 9 and I'm flipping channels, I am not laboring. It is the absence of labor, but it is not restful. So what is restful? Well, sometimes for me, playing basketball is I'm an old person, but I still play basketball. Played on Monday night. I used to play 3 times a week, but one of my games still hasn't started back up from COVID. But we play Monday nights, and that's restful to me. Now, I come home exhausted. How could that be restful? It's a different part of my body and brain that is used, and engaging that different part of my body and brain is restorative. The thing we are looking for is restorative rest. Rest is not the absence of labor, it's something that is restorative. So another thing for me that's actually quite restorative is watching basketball on television. In another lifetime, I would have been a basketball coach. I love the strategy, so when I watch a basketball game, I watch it like a coach does. Who's in the game? What are the matchups? What are they doing now? Why are they doing that? How is that setting up this other thing? oh, the ball's moving here, that means they're saying, my brain is engaged in a way that it's not when I'm watching. I don't understand baseball well enough. I'll listen to baseball and they'll tell me, oh, what he was doing was he was trying to go to right field because you can see the way he dipped his right shoulder. I couldn't see that. You show it to me and I'll believe you, but I didn't see that in the moment. But in basketball, I can see this stuff and my brain is so engaged and I'm so interested in that. That's restorative to me. I need to find things that are restorative because that enables me to be able to have a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. I think one of the things that's happened in the pandemic is our people are so tired that they skip the restorative rest and settle for the junk food rest, which is the escape from the pain. If I can escape from how hard life is for a while, I will pretend that I have rested. And then at the end of it, I will feel like I'm no more rested, but at least I didn't have to deal with the pain for a while. That sounds almost like alcohol or a drug. Yes?
So could, you know, you were talking about flipping the channel in the junk food, but if you find something, not just anything, but if you find something that you're looking for that might be inspirational, that might lift you up, can that
Sure.
be
And flipping channels might be really restorative for you. I don't get to name anything like that for anybody else. You know, far be it from me to sit in judgment on anything. But I'm just saying, for myself, I know I have some habits that are junk foodish and some habits that are restorative, and I've got to be honest about the differences. And so do we. And we need to find ways to help our congregations be honest about the differences. Yes, sir?
And some of our restorative rests have been taken away for the last 20 months.
Yeah, sure enough.
And so we miss those. And I'm a musician. Choir rehearsals don't happen
Yeah.
the way they once did. But how many people said, used to tell me on Wednesday night, I come in dead tired, but I feel so enthused and excited after I leave choir rehearsal.
And now you can't do it.
So restored.
Yep.
And that disappeared.
My wife and I were scheduled to spend the spring on sabbatical in Europe. I do a ton of administrative work at my school, and so I can't just take sabbatical. I have to flee because I need time zones away, otherwise they will find me. I have made that mistake, and I know what that's like. And so, I wrote this book here. I wrote most of it in Europe when we went on sabbatical in 2015. Here's what we did. We went in January. Nobody goes to Britain in January. It is cold and rainy and yucky. And so we wrote to somebody who had an Airbnb, and we said, if we rent the entire place for a month, can we get it at 1/3 price? And they looked at, well, we're not going to rent it to anybody else. Okay. And so we got a place at 1/3 price. And here's my habit. I would get up at 4:30 in the morning every morning, and I would write until Jeannie got up at breakfast. We'd have breakfast. And then I'd write again until about 11. And by then, I was spent. I wasn't going to get any more writing done. And we would leave the flat, and we would go out, and we would do fun stuff. We'd go to museums. We'd just be in the city. Most of this was in London and Paris. We'd just go, and we would be in the city. And that was really restorative to me. But, for most people, I can't recommend get up at 4:30 in the morning to write. For me, that worked great. We would then come home and often go to bed by 8:30, whatever it was. We have no interest in nightlife. We didn't go out and see the city or something. But it was a really wonderful rhythm of labor and rest. I got so much writing done, and we had just a delightful time seeing the city. I had all planned for fall of 20. I had a research project. I was just in there. What do you think I did? I didn't leave my daughter's bedroom because that was the only place we could set up that I could work. And so I was on a card table in my daughter's bedroom. And all those meetings I was fleeing time zones away from? Guess who went to those meetings? Because they found me. I mean, they couldn't say to me, can you just come to, could you just come, in for a penny, in for a pound. And I was stuck. So I needed to find what works for me. You need to find what works for you. I have a friend who's a writer who wants to write something, and she's like, I can't get up at 4:30 in the morning. I'm sorry, there's not enough coffee on the planet for that. And I said, I don't even drink coffee. I didn't need that. Okay, fine. Everybody finds what works for them. And when you find what works for you, look for the thing that's restorative. But in my own congregation, introducing that word restorative has changed the meaning of Sabbath. So, any thoughts or comments on that before I go on? Looked like a couple of you wanted to say something, and I thought maybe even rebut me. There's no? Okay, so we're going to have no coffee.
I'm struggling. I seem to be the one that struggles in the room.
Well, what you're doing is you are naming things that other people are struggling with, but now you become the designated scapegoat. So go right ahead. There's a whole biblical term for what you're doing.
We spent a great deal of time on Sabbath, and it was good because I appreciate every bit of it. I need it myself. But what I'm struggling with is where we started with that, and then maybe it seemed like we went down a rabbit trail, is drawing the connection between Christian practices and making spiritual sense out of people's languages and losses. And I haven't been able to make that connection yet.
So, let's start it this way. If you listen to long enough, do you think you're going to hear from people, I'm tired?
Absolutely.
One of the things that I have been able to say to my congregation, and that we have been able to say with a group of congregations that we've worked with, is that one of the goals during the pandemic is to help each other create healthy rhythms of labor and rest. And so, for example, I'll give you an example. I told you about how elementary school age kids, parents with elementary school age kids are having a really tough time of it right now. One of the things that we've got is a group within our church that's formed kind of a little shared, I don't know what they call each other, but basically they have found a way where on Mondays this little group of kids goes to this person's house. And on Tuesdays they go to this person's house. And they found a way to, now this is since they're back in school, but whatever. The point is they found a way to share the burden so that there are some days where, watching 5 kids and watching 2 kids is approximately the same exhaustion. You're still tired at the end of the day. And that you can make it work. And so they found ways to do that. That's, I'm not saying that's what you should do, but they did that because we had a conversation at church about koinonia. And we had a conversation about what it means to be mutually engaged with one another and how we are together in this. And so there's that group that, finding a healthy rhythm of labor and rest should not be an individual thing. We may need to work on that together. And so if you listen to people, you're going to hear that finding a healthy rhythm of labor and rest, or you're going to hear they're tired, and you can offer to them the idea of a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. That's what I was trying to say about making spiritual sense. Can I throw one more in for you? One of the things that a number of congregations have found helpful is reinventing the concept of hospitality. Now, we're in the South. They have a phrase called Southern hospitality. So, you're the poster child for hospitality. But at many, many, many of the churches that we've worked with, they say hospitality has become a shadow of what it once was. And now what it means is having a covered dish dinner or a potluck dinner. And some people get to come and some people don't. And you eat the food and then you go on. And I would like to suggest to you that eating together is hospitable, but it is not the nature of what Christian hospitality is. Christian hospitality is instead treating outsiders like insiders. That's what hospitality is. And there are privileges that come with being an insider. When I extend those privileges to an outsider, that's hospitality. Let me give you an example. I forgot my friend's name here. Jackie. Thank you, Jackie, for understanding that I forgot. Let's say I invite Jackie to my house. Does she just walk up to the refrigerator, open up, and get an apple? I don't know. You can if you want, but okay, let's say my daughter comes home from college. And she's home, my daughter lives in Columbus, Ohio now. We only get to see her a couple of times a year. Let's say she comes in and she just gets up and goes and gets an apple. Am I offended? Why not? It's her home. She's an insider. Part of the privileges of being an insider is you get access to this stuff. Even if you are a guest in my home, you still feel like an outsider. So we had I mentioned my youth minister. He came and visited me this last weekend because we have a mutual friend that was being ordained. And so he stayed at our house. And at one point, we know each other well enough that when I said, make yourself at home, he felt okay doing that. And so he's on East Coast time. And so he comes and he stays with us. And he ends up getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning Pacific time because he's jet lagged and he's wide awake. And he went ahead and went to the refrigerator and got some food to eat all on his own. Was I offended? Of course not. Well, there's part of that. But the point is, he was he had been around long enough that he felt like it was okay to be an insider. Treating outsiders like insiders. Let me give you an example from my own congregation. There's a woman named Carol at my church that is the point person for dealing with homelessness and homeless people. And so a few years ago, there was a couple that came to the church and knocked on the door of the church and said, we need help with food. And they were a young couple in their early 20s, and they were living out of a van. And so Carol, who lived nearby, came down, and she talked to them. She started by listening to them, and she discovered that they really wanted things to be different. And so she did a couple of things. She made sure that they got vouchers for food. She made sure that by the time that they left, they had actually been put onto a thing where the place they drove from our church was to a temporary housing space that we had now worked out for them so that they could stay there until they could get into a shelter. Okay, you do those kinds of things. But here's the other thing she did. As she was talking to them, she saw that they had a little baby. And so she made sure that, she said, can we get you some diapers and the kinds of things you're going to need for your baby? Which was not part of the vouchers that they would, okay, they got that. And then she also, when she was doing that, she looked in the van and she saw that, that I started to call him by a real name. We'll call him Reuben in this story, had a bass guitar. And she said, oh, do you play guitar? And he goes, well, he tried to explain to her the difference between guitar and bass, and she didn't understand it. But that's okay. And she said, would you like to play in our worship band on Sunday? Well, what do you... This was a Friday. And so she just called up the guy that was in charge of worship and said, there's a guy that's, we're going to call him Reuben, that's coming on Sunday who's going to play in the worship band. And he showed up on Sunday morning and he played in the band. Now, I tell this story often and all the music people cringe. You'll notice she didn't ask if he was any good at it. She didn't ask if he was a moral, upstanding person who was leading in worship. She didn't ask whether the couple was married. She didn't ask all these things that we would normally ask. Here's what she thought. If there had been a 23-year-old in our church who had raised in our church, who played guitar or band or bass, we would be badgering him to come and play in the worship band. Well, if that's the case, we're just going to treat this guy like an insider, and I'm going to invite him to come. And guess what? He came on Sunday. He played in the band. He's actually pretty good, I'm told. Over the next couple of months, our congregation still worked with them. They ended up he found a job, works in a tire store. He found they've got a place to live. And now here it is, 6 years later, they are still members of our church. And we recently had a new couple come. And you know who the best evangelist in our church for that new couple was? No, their little son. Because he's like the world's, you know how some kids just got it? He went up to the other kids in that family and said, come and play with me. And they did it. And anytime your kids are loved, you feel loved. And so he brought those kids out to the playground and they started playing together. And the parents go, I guess we're going to this church. But what's the key moment in all of this? It's when you treated an outsider like an insider. That's hospitality. Think about this. I'm going to sound like a professor for a minute, sorry. If you study early church history, there was a period where the Roman Empire was not welcoming to the church, killing them and the like. Yet the church spread. Why? Well, the church fathers will tell you, here is the phrase that the Romans used to describe the Christians. Oh, how they love one another. Because here's what hospitality meant in the Roman Empire. There was actually a term for hospitality in the Roman Empire. What it was is that it was a transaction. If you were a person of much higher status than I was, I would invite you to my house in order to create an obligation, so you had to invite me and I would get to meet your high status friends. And it was a way of social climbing. That was what hospitality meant, was a way of social climbing, was I create an obligation, you have to invite me to your house, and therefore I can get something out of it. And what did the Christians do instead? They just loved people. And the more they just kept loving, especially the poor, they loved the people that they shared with them, they gave them things, and it just freaked the Romans out. And what happened? Christianity spread like wildfire. In this day and age of how absolutely fractious the world is, what would happen if we just decided, I'm going to treat outsiders like insiders? I'm going to invite people that I don't agree with into my home on their terms and listen to them because they are made in the image of God, not because I want something out of them. Do you think anybody would notice? So, I'm about to say something about sociology of religion. You get the right to correct me if I'm wrong. Sociologists in the last 5 years, especially through a Pew study, asked a bunch of non-Christians to describe Christianity in a single word. What was the most popular word that they used to describe Christianity? Nope, it was close. Anybody? Judgmental. The number one word that non-Christians think of Christians is that we are judgmental. We are a... What is the Reformation? You all heard about the Reformation? The Catholics are leaving just as I talk about the Reformation. The essence of the Reformation is this, that we agreed on justification by faith, or justification by grace through faith alone. And even Catholics would be very, every Catholic I know would commit to justification by grace. We all think grace is worth talking about, right? there are very few things that if you don't understand, you don't understand Christianity. But I'm guessing grace is one of them. If you misunderstand grace, you misunderstand Christianity. And whatever judgmental is, the opposite of it is grace. And so if we want to make a change in our world, if we want to engage in evangelism, the first thing we have to do is listen with grace and listen without judgment. One of the practices that I talk about there is, I talk about generosity and gratitude. I don't actually think those are separate practices. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I don't know how gratitude exists without it becoming generosity. And that's just, the way I read Scripture. And what I think both of them are is grace in action. Let me give you two stories. Again, I'm going to talk about the Bible for a minute. I hope that doesn't freak you out. Somebody's opposed to the Bible. I want to point you to Matthew 20. Matthew 20 is, at the beginning of Matthew 20, there's a parable there that I have to say I really misunderstood when I was growing up. Matthew 20 is a parable of the late coming workers. So you all know the story. At 9 a.m., the steward, I always like telling stories that have a steward, we'll call him my grandfather, he goes out and he hires a bunch of laborers and says, you come and I'll pay you a fair day's wage. And then at noon he goes out and gets a whole bunch of people and says, I'll pay you. And then goes at 3, he gets 5 minutes to 5, he goes and brings some. And then he comes back and he pays them all the same thing. And every person I know responds to that parable by saying the same thing. That's not fair. And you know what? You have now properly understood the parable. I kept thinking when I was growing up that clearly I've misunderstood the parable because fair is good, and Jesus wanted to be fair, right? No, the whole point of the parable is grace isn't fair. Fair means you get exactly what you deserve. If things are fair, you get exactly what you deserve. What does Scripture say that you deserve? All have sinned, the wages of sin is death. If I get what I deserve, I probably end up with death. What does it say about grace? For by grace you have been saved through faith, not of yourself, because it is the free gift of God that no one should boast. I get better than I deserve. That is the entire point of grace. If you say that's not fair, what you're saying is, I want things to be fair. You don't want things to be fair. If things are fair, you get exactly what you deserve. You want grace. And so, one of the phrases that I've planted in my congregation over and over again is, you don't want things to be fair, you want grace. Can I brag for just this bit? One of my very proudest moments as a teacher was this. I still tear up a little thinking about it. I found out after I'd been doing this saying this for years, one of the teenagers in my church used that phrase as the thesis for her college essay. Nice. And I thought, my work here is done. I'm done. I got a teenager to pay attention to this enough that they actually wrote about it. Doesn't matter what else, I've had a good day. You don't want things to be fair, you want grace. But that's not where the story ends. The story ends because I've got to tie that parable to another one. There's the parable of the unforgiving servant. The guy that owed a debt he could never pay, the king forgave him, and then he wouldn't forgive his brother or sister that owed him a small little amount. And the message of that is that those who have received grace must practice grace. Does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound, am I getting that one right? So let's put those two together. You don't want things to be fair, you want grace. And those who have received grace must practice grace. I think in our world right now, that might be the best summary of the gospel that I can come up with. Because most of the things that I find difficult in my world are about people who no longer feel the need to practice grace. And if you look at the stereotype of the church in the world, the reason that they say we are judgmental is that we have earned it. And so if you want to become the kind of place that people want to, remember we talked about the drink the weak ties? And you got to change so that when somebody comes in the door, they stick around because there's something there. If you want to change, I think the most important thing we can do is embody grace. And so if I were planting language, the things that I would plant in my congregation are, God can handle your honesty, even and especially if you're angry at God. We need a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. You don't want things to be fair. You want grace. And those who have received grace must practice grace. Those are the messages that I would be planting in like 972 different ways in my congregation. While in the background, I'm talking to my staff and the people that I work with and say, who did you listen to? What did you hear? Who are you going to listen to next week? So there's the stuff we do in the background while we're announcing over and over again. What's the four things I said? I said the first one was, God can handle your honesty, even when you're angry at God. Healthy rhythm of labor and rest. You don't want fair, you want grace. And those who have received grace must practice grace. If you can find a way just to say those things. Let's say, for example, we got to vote. And that whatever it was, you got somehow your congregation to believe those four things. Would your congregation be different? I think it would. I think those are the kinds of things we need. And each one of those is an embodiment of a historic Christian practice. It's not like you're saying, I'm going to invent a new gospel for, remember Gina can't invent a new gospel for Tran, but she can bring to him a gospel of hope that says things that will be transforming. I'm thinking that that's a good, I have more stuff I can do, but I'm reading the room. Leadership begins with listening. And I'm thinking that maybe this might be as far as we need to go. And so I'm looking at you like I need permission to not do what I'm told. Which is, it may well be that you want to ask some questions of me or of Jennifer. I'm open to that, but I'm fighting the temptation to finish my outline because I'm reading the room and saying that might be as far as we need to go. Michael, what's your thoughts? So, am I guessing that the yellow sheets are evaluation of some kind?
Four questions, and it's just an evaluation that we will use going forward. Completely anonymous, and you can just place those face down on the registration table. There's a tray out there for those. And if you fill out your evaluation, you get a new all.
And apparently 2 books.
The box said the book will come in there.
But you gotta leave the form, okay?
Here's the deal. Some people gave them a lot of money that they're spending on you. And what those people want is to know what your experience is. The least you can do is be honest with them. Yes.
So, great information, great presentation. What could possibly get in the way?
What could possibly get in there? Would you like me to answer? So if you asked me, we've got, hundreds of churches now we've worked with. The number one predictor of whether or not you're going to be successful is whether you're willing to do those 3 questions. The number one predictor of whether or not you're going to fail is this. In order to do it, it takes time. And the phrase we use, you have to maintain disciplined attention. The number one reason people fail is they start but don't finish. I can give you a suggestion as to how to start and not stray. I want you to invent a person that I'm going to call Helen. The reason I have is that one of the churches had a woman named Helen. And it was, you can't have the pastor or the person who is the staff person be in charge of all of this. There are too many competing commitments. I'm looking at you, Joel. You've got 993 things that you've got on your head. There's no way that you can be in charge of this. So here's what you do. Designate someone. Like a designated driver? They are a designated asker. And it is their job to make sure that every time you meet, you ask those 3 questions. And so your accountability as leader is to Helen. Helen's only job is to be making sure that you ask those questions. Now, here is almost every Helen that I know that has worked is somebody who is older and wiser than the pastor and not afraid to scold them. Do you know what I'm talking about? The mothers of the church that are basically somebody, in my church they're all named Barbara. But somebody who could come up to the pastor and say, "You're blowing it," and not have to mince words. And the pastor's not going to be insulted. The pastor has already designated this designated driver and told them, "I want you to do this." And when the pastor goes to make excuses, the person is old enough and wise enough to go, "You're making excuses. Let's figure this out." And they figure out how next time it's not going to happen. It can't be somebody who's going to be scolding or mean or anything like that. But you know the kind of personality I'm talking about? Somebody who absolutely, the pastor or whoever is absolutely convinced that they're on my side and they're not going to take any guff. You know that person? Yeah. There's one table, I will not say which one, where they all looked at the same person. From what I understand, Carrie, you're the designated driver here at the... Yeah. So what often, if I can point to over and over, we wrote 6 different Lilly reports. In 4 of them, we said the number one predictor of churches not doing well is they were not able to maintain disciplined attention. And of those that were not able to maintain disciplined attention, almost none of them designated a driver or designated someone named Helen. Is that fair? Yes, sir.
How do you introduce these questions to your leadership and your congregation?
Okay.
Do you just at the next business meeting, you start with those questions?
Yeah.
And they say, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, just simply, here's almost everybody who's done it just by saying, leadership begins with listening. There are very few people who rise up in protest at that. And, we just say leadership begins with listening. And then we say, one of the things that we've learned is that if we want to go forward, we need to do a better job listening to people. And so here's what we're going to do to listen. And chapter 3 in the book is going to give you all sorts of handles on that. There's also a little appendix on empathetic listening that you can read. So lots of stuff on listening. But the only objection I have typically heard to listening is I don't have time. And those who are in authority can use their authority to say, I'm going to keep asking this question, and that's going to create an incentive for you to have an answer. And then what will happen is after a while they've failed at it, and then we can talk together and say, okay, let's figure out how to do this well. Because here's what often happens is you say you've got a staff of 6. You say it to the staff of 6, where I say staff loosely, volunteers and the like. And let's say 2 of them do it and 4 of them don't. But the 2 of them do it have great stories. Well, all of a sudden now I've got the negative incentive of my boss wants me to, and the positive incentive that the people that are doing it seem like it's working well. And you talk about it, and pretty soon it becomes contagious. And I've heard again and again folks tell the story of, at first we did not like this. We thought this was a dumb idea until we started listening and hearing things we did not expect to hear. And the more we listened, the more we said, we got to keep doing this. So that's all I can say. Is that a hand up or is that just an amen?
That's a hand up. Yeah, and now, a lot of these situations you're describing are one-on-one conversations. Obviously, there are spaces where there will be multiple people talking together.
Amen.
And in every church I've ever been a part of or led, there are some people who are very accustomed to taking up space and being listened to. And there are others who are often not heard as well. Do you have any suggestions in situations where those sets of folks are mixed together at ensuring that we hear, that we encourage folks who are used to taking up a lot of space to maybe step back a little bit, and folks who are not accustomed to being heard, make sure that they're heard?
So a couple of things. Number one is the listening that I do tends to be more one-on-one or family, visiting a family. Now you can't, I'll give you an example. I've got, one of my mentors is a pastor in the Pacific Northwest who loves being a small pastor. He's one of the most gifted preachers I know and keeps getting offered these massive pulpits and then running away from them and saying, no, I want to stay in my little church. But one of the things he hates doing is talking on the phone. He's like, I'm just so over that. Well, he wouldn't mind talking to people face to face, but then the pandemic comes along. And so I call him and I say, so Dave, what you doing? He goes, I'm spending 20 hours a week on the phone. And he said that in that tone that says, and you know me well enough to know how much I love that. But I need to be listening to people. So a lot of the listening we do is just one-on-one. But what about reporting back? You say to a group of people, what did you hear? The talkers are going to talk. So one of the things you can do before say, in a moment I'm going to ask, who'd you listen to? What did you hear? Who are you going to listen to? But before I do that, I want to give everybody a chance to just write something down. What are you going to say? And then you go around the room and each person gets a turn. And the talkers only get to be able to say what's on their paper. And the people that aren't really as much the talkers got a chance to write it out and say something. And by pausing and giving everybody a chance to write something down first, it levels the playing field. Before we're done, do you mind if I pray? Is that okay? Am I allowed to do that, or is that somebody else's job?
No, you can certainly pray.
No, I can't pray.
No. I mean, on behalf of Samford and the Center, again, we want to say thank you for giving your time. And thank you, Scott.
My pleasure.
This has been a rich day. And we're grateful for you being here in this broad cross-section of the Christian family in this room, in this space, all gathered around this theme of, swinging toward the next faithful step. And thank you for helping us process that some, Scott. I don't think there's any other direction we need to give. And so, Scott, offer the prayer, and we're grateful for this day.
God help us. That's the prayer that we often come with. Sometimes it's more than we can bear. Sometimes it seems like we get covered in all that muck. Sometimes we are just absolutely inadequate to what we see in front of us. But then we remember that just before you left, even after you gave the Great Commission, the very last thing you said to us is, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And then you sent your Spirit to bind us together and to live within us. There are people in this room who probably don't even agree with each other on a lot of stuff. But we agree that we worship Jesus. And we agree that your Spirit came that we might have life. Bind us together in your name, even when it makes us uncomfortable. To thine be the glory. Amen.